Hey, gang, this week's episode is brought to you by Royal Retros, the king of throwbacks. Hey, if you're looking for teams and leagues that don't exist anymore, but you'd like to remember them in high-quality jersey or uniform format, hey, some of those teams were legendary, some of them were disasters, but they all live at Royal Retros. Check them out. RoyalRetros.com. Use that promo code SEATS for 10% off all of your purchases. Check them out now. And now, check out this episode.
Well, it's opening day for the Spokane Indians. We are less than a half an hour away now from the first pitch against the Vancouver Canadians. Alex Crescenti's live at Avista Stadium for us. And Alex, the excitement is building for the start of a new season. You know I love going out there mainly for the treats, the snacks.
Yeah, Kirsten, what's that old saying, hope springs eternal? Well, the Spokane Indians are hoping that means true for them. They're coming off a disappointing 2023 campaign. They missed out on the postseason, but they return a pretty loaded roster. 16 guys are coming back from last year, and they got 5 of the top 30 prospects, so there is certainly no shortage of talent on this squad. And the headliner of the group may be pitcher Chase Dollander. He was a top 10 pick by the Rockies in 2023 out of Tennessee, and he's getting the nod tonight. So needless to say, he's excited about getting his professional career started here in Spokane.
It's a huge honor. I'm so excited to finally get going. Obviously, I didn't play last year. After I got drafted, just kind of got shut down and just kind of recover and rest from the season that I had. So I'm biting at the bit to be able to go, and I know these guys behind me are wanting to go too. So it's going to be really exciting.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Well, hello there. It's your friend Tim Hanlon. It is Good Seats Still Available, the curious little podcast that is devoted to, say it with me, will you, what used to be in professional sports. Thank you for coming on by. We appreciate it as always. Thank you for tolerating our rebroadcast last week. Many of you enjoyed that episode and newly discovered it. That's why we do that on occasion when, for whatever reasons, we can't get a fresh new episode out to you. We like to go back into the Wayback Machine and pull out something from the archive that will hopefully delight you and perhaps be new and reintroduction for you. And that was the case with our conversation back from 2017 with the great Paul Gardner celebrating his 94th birthday last week. God bless. And there is no wiser soul or sage on the longitudinal history of the sport of soccer in this country and in the continent of North America. And a wonderful episode. It holds up for sure. This week, we are going to move our sights back to baseball. And it's spring. The baseball season is finally and firmly underway. Hopes does spring eternal, as you heard there on that clip from KXLY television at Spokane, Washington / Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. That's the market. It's the Morgan Murphy station in that market. And that was from about a month ago or so as the beginnings, the leading into the opening day of the Spokane Indians. Yes, they have chosen to keep that name despite the Cleveland Guardians having disposed of it. But it's minor league baseball. It's now all becoming more corporate, so we'll see just how long that name lasts. But Spokane is a team in the obviously in the minors. It is in the high A class in the league known as the Northwest League. And yes, we know that, of course, there's been lots of reconfigurations as Major League Baseball has put its thumbprint and then some on what used to be a relatively ragtag, but earnestly so, minor league baseball system. But the corporatization is well underway, and the Spokane Indians franchise is no stranger to it. But we want to go back. So this is a team that still exists, and obviously that's a little bit of a flyer for us when we try to look at things that existed in the past. But you could say it's also not been consecutive. It's had a little bit of a checkered history. But the team goes way back, I think, at its earliest days, the Spokane Indians, in its actual name, too. The name has never really changed to what used to be known as the Pacific Northwest League back in 1890. So baseball has been very much part of the fabric of the Spokane region in the Pacific Northwest for some time, and Lord knows a ton of different leagues and classes along the way, and a couple of departures and pauses along the way, and that allows us to at least qualify for this conversation. And it is this week with our guest Eric Vickrey, who not only sort of regales us in a little bit of the Spokane Indians history, but we're going to focus specifically on an event, a tragic event at that, that occurred with this team back in 1946, when a bus carrying the then Spokane Indians baseball team, then in the Class D leagues, crashed to the bottom of a ravine in Washington State's Cascade Mountains, killing 9 players. It was the deadliest, and still remains to this day, the deadliest accident in the history of American professional sports. And the book that Eric has written is stunning and a shining of light on a story that, in many respects, has been kind of forgotten. And we'll get into whether the Indians have commemorated this and how they manifest the memory of this tragic accident in 1946. His book is called Season of Shattered Dreams, Postwar Baseball, the Spokane Indians, and a Tragic Bus Crash That Changed Everything. In our conversation with Eric, you're going to get into the story of what was not too dissimilar from what you just heard, a very optimistic baseball season in 1946. We'll set the tone. It's the end of the war. A lot of guys who were in the service or the services defending our country abroad were now coming back. Those who were playing prior and sort of getting back to quote unquote normal life, although it wasn't all that normal, as we'll hear in our chat. But a lot of optimism, both in the country as well as in baseball generally, for a lot of players coming back, as well as specifically this team, the Spokane Indians. And we'll let Eric sort of lay out sort of this tragic but ultimately very memorable and commemorative conversation about this tragic bus crash that did shatter the season, but it forever transformed baseball and certainly in the Pacific Northwest with this team known as the Spokane Indians. And, hope does indeed spring eternal. Chase Dollander, the guy interviewed there at the end of this clip, is probably one of the most touted rookies in Class A ball right now. He of University of Tennessee star player, and he did not win his first outing, as was led up in that clip, but he did have, I want to say he didn't get a decision in that game, but I think he had like 8 strikeouts in that game at about 5 innings pitched, off to a very good start, that of Chase Dollander. So looking for him probably in the Colorado Rockies system, or perhaps maybe even getting a cup of coffee in the show, if not this year, soon there enough. So hope springs eternal in that story, in our conversation coming up with Eric Vickrey in just a moment. And again, the book is called Season of Shattered Dreams. You can find it wherever good books are found. Of course, we appreciate it if you go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode number 348. I think that's the number, right? Yes, indeed. And you'll find this conversation, this interview with Eric, nicely posted there, and there'll be a couple of convenient links to this book. I think it's only available right now in hardcover, but depending on when you're listening to this, perhaps there's a paperback version of the book to come, maybe even a Kindle version in the weeks to come. Of course, thank you when you do that. We got a couple of referrals, shekels of referral love. Boy, I tongue-tied today. And thank you for doing that, and thank you for listening to our chat here with our new pal, Eric Vickrey, as we talk about the 1946 tragic season of the Spokane Indians. Here's our conversation we had just a couple of weeks back. Please, as always, enjoy. For our audience, as you probably know, right, this silly little show has sort of been an exploration into lots of things that used to be in professional sports. Ostensibly, it's around teams and leagues and events and those kinds of things that have literally come and gone or relocated or been previously domiciled and stuff. And in this case, we're squinting a little bit here because this is a team that in many respects still exists, but obviously was of a different form. But for our audience, maybe just a little bit of background about you before we get into the story and your adjunct to the story. How'd you become interested? What's the motivation, I guess, for you to go deep into it? Because it's very interesting. It's sad. It's intriguing. I'm just curious as to how you came about it.
Sure. Well, first and foremost, I'm a big baseball fan and have been really my whole life. Got started watching baseball in the 1980s, kind of fell in love with collecting baseball cards and going to St. Louis Cardinals games, which is my hometown team. I'm from Alton, Illinois. And had just been a fan all my life. Also grew up playing the game as well. And really hadn't done any writing about baseball until 4 or 5 years ago. And really got into it during the start of the pandemic when I was more or less looking for something to pass the time. I started writing articles for the Society for American Baseball Research. They have something called the Bio Project where you can really dig into a player's career and life and write up their biographies. So I started doing some of those. And I always have an affinity for guys who had like cup of coffee careers. And I was writing an article about a player named John Leovich who played in one single game and got a hit off of Bob Feller. In 1946, he played for the Bremerton Blue Jackets, which is part of the Western International League, and came across a newspaper article that described this bus crash involving the Spokane Indians, and was very intrigued that I had never heard about this accident, and the details were horrific, and it kind of just stuck in the back of my mind, and I started doing a little bit of research and read about Jack Lohrke, whose story is pretty well documented, but realized that there were a number of other stories and players on the team whose life stories hadn't been told. So that's what I kind of set out to do with this book, is really dig into that team and bring the story, which has largely been forgotten, to light.
How does an Illinois guy like you, and you're talking to somebody who's in the northern suburbs of Chicago right now, in our little studio here, a little cozy studio in Lake Forest, Illinois. How does the then Northwest League or the Western International, whatever, we'll get to it. There's a Western International League, I guess, at the time. How does that hit your radar? Have you moved there? Did you have a fascination with the West Coast? How that?
Yeah, so I moved to the Pacific Northwest about 10 years ago for work, and my wife and I live in Seattle. So we have traveled back and forth on I-90 across Snoqualmie Pass, where this crash occurred, countless times. We go hiking in the area. We go to concerts at the gorge. So to me, it also struck me, just given the local and regional interest of the story, the fact that this all occurred kind of in my backyard here certainly drew me to the story.
Well, all right, let's get into the background of the team first of all, because this is a team that not only still exists today, same name. Lord knows it's gone through a zillion different classes as minor league baseball has evolved and tweaked and turned and whatever, and now is arguably much more under the thumb of Major League Baseball with this Class High A thing, and the Northwest League. But maybe a little bit of background about this team, because this is something that's been around in Spokane for since 1890 or so. So this is a long-standing team with very little, if any, breaks along the way, I think.
Yeah. The first professional game, like you said, was played in 1890 in Spokane, and they had some leagues that kind of came and went during the late 1800s. And it was really in 1903 that the Spokane Indians became a team, and they were actually first called the Inlanders. That was the local newspaper in Spokane. The Spokesman Review held a contest to come up with a team name, and the winning selection was Inlanders. But a few weeks later, newspapers started referring to the team as the Indians for unknown reasons. There was never any documentation as to why that was the case.
I'm sorry, roughly what year was this around?
This was in 1903.
Well, that stands to reason, right? We've heard many, even years later, right? It's the sort of informal appellation that get that news writers, the sports writers and stuff sort of give to teams and stuff, and their informal nicknames kind of wind up sticking and becoming the official names over time. So
Yes.
not out of this sounds very congruent with what we've heard from lots of stuff in Northeast and Central United States baseball history too.
Exactly. Yeah. I think the Brooklyn Dodgers were known as the Robins for a time, and there have been other team names which have been changed here and there. But the name Indians stuck with the Spokane franchise, and except for a period between the Great Depression, World War I years, from about 1921 to 1937, there was no baseball in Spokane during those years. But ever since 37, the current iteration of the Indians has been in existence.
And tell me roughly sort of like how entrenched, I guess, this team was. I mean, the fact that it's still around is probably indicative, right? This is, a time where we're talking like, this is way before the contiguous 48 states were filled out, right? So you have a fledgling baseball environment in the very distant realm of the United States, where arguably, as we've learned, the Northeast and the central part of the United States was pretty much the cradle of it. And could you define it as an outpost? I mean, like how rigorous and or legit were the leagues here? What would you sort of the constitution of the team? Obviously, in the 50s or so, this, the Pacific Coast League became much more solid, right? With
Yes,
almost to the point of being as good, if not maybe even better than a few teams in some of the major leagues. Give me a sense of sort of that evolution, the Pacific Northwest and baseball around this time and beyond.
sure. Well, you had the Pacific Coast League, which, of course, that was considered in many ways on par with the major leagues, and you had teams in Seattle and Portland that were part of the Pacific Coast League. The Spokane Indians were part of the Western International League, which was Class B league that was formed in 1937. And there were teams in British Columbia, Washington State, Oregon, and I think at some points Idaho. And there were 8 teams in the league, and they traveled by bus to and from those cities. And it was, Class B, I would say would be roughly equivalent to maybe a high A or double A today. And the Spokane Indians and the league got a fair amount of talent. They were sort of a farm team for a lot of the Pacific Coast leagues. A lot of those teams ended up sending some of their better prospects down to the Western International League.
So interesting. So as most baseball historians sort of recognized, as you pointed out, that the Pacific Coast League was, I don't know, the third best league, if you will, in the country. In some respects, debatable when you talked about certain teams and stuff. And but it's interesting too, because even after this period of time that we're going to be talking about the tragedy and all, this team actually did bob up and down in the Pacific Coast League years afterwards, in the 50s and 60s, and then again in the 70s and early 80s too. So it's a very interesting sort of dynamic with this team of how AAA / single A and maybe even double A in between, it sort of has existed in the years since this time.
Exactly. Yeah. When the Los Angeles Dodgers moved west from Brooklyn, they were looking to set up a AAA team, and they chose Spokane as their AAA affiliate. So that's when Spokane became a AAA city, and had some great teams, as you mentioned, maybe even more talent than a lot of major league teams in the late 60s, early 70s, with Lasorda as manager, and guys like Steve Garvey and Bill Russell and Davey Lopes and Charlie Huff, and I could go on and on. But they had some very talented players in those years, and then ultimately in the 70s dropped down to single A, which they are still today. They're an affiliate of the Colorado Rockies currently.
Okay, so today's Northwest League, right? Would you? I'm getting the sense that this Western International League around this time, and we're talking, the 1940s, I guess, is probably the best place to sort of center the lead into the rest of the conversation. This Western International League, I got to get a sense is pretty much, and I'm not the historian, you are. Is it fair to say it's the predecessor to today's Northwest League?
I guess you could say that many of the cities that were in the Western International League were the same cities who now host teams in the Northwest League. So in that respect, it's a similar league and probably a similar class of player, you could say as well.
Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to get at is like I have a tough time, and I know this is sort of it's a daunting task. Class B, right? Around the time we're talking about. Again, the equivalent is to what today? You think that's high A, double A ish?
Yes, that's where I would put it. They had class C and D also at that time, and class D would be your players just coming out of high school, so your teenage players, and then they would slowly advance up, oftentimes just one level at a time. But the Class B league, the Western International League in particular, was more or less the farm, the AAA league, as you could put it, for the Pacific Coast League. So it was a notch below that league, which, if you consider Pacific Coast League back then as AAA, a notch below that would be AA, or in this case, Class B.
And I guess the other sort of naive question from me is was it relatively self-contained, right? So the Pacific Coast League essentially being the predominant league on the West Coast, right? And this the Western International League / Northwest League or whatever it evolved to almost became like you're sort of suggesting the feeder to that. But is that self-contained? But I guess the PCL is also itself, a feeder to the major leagues at that time too. But it also feels like, though, that there might be almost some compartmentalization there in that region, right, where you've got the quote unquote major league of that region and the feeder league into that. Or am I just making all that up?
No, that's a fair way to put it. And another thing to keep in mind is that these franchises were mostly independently operated. For instance, the Spokane Indians were owned by Sam Collins, gentleman from Idaho, and he formed working agreements with the Oakland Oaks, San Diego Padres, and also New York Yankees. So they weren't a direct affiliate with a particular Pacific Coast League team, but they had sort of these informal agreements that each of those franchises would send them a certain number of players to help fill out their roster, and that was the case kind of throughout the Western International League.
All right, you mentioned before sort of discovering this tragedy. Before maybe we get into the actual sort of the layout of the story, how do you approach putting the background and the narrative of best telling this story together? Like, what are your resources? What are your obviously not a lot of people around first person narratives and that kind of stuff. How do you even go about, once you discovered this story and its need to be told, how do you go about the process of framing all of it and approaching how to put it together?
Sure. Well, my first goal was to try to find out as much about each individual player on the team as I could. And in some cases, that was easier than others. For instance, one of the first players I started to dig into was Vic Picetti, who was the youngest player on the team. He was 18 years old and out of San Francisco. And I was able to track down Vic's niece. And she had scrapbooks that the family kept from when Vic was coming up through high school and into his minor league career. That was just full of photos and newspaper articles and letters that Vic had written himself. So in a case like that, I was able to, it was a real goldmine of just finding out tons of information about this particular player. And then you had another player on the team, like George Risk, for example, was the starting shortstop and had the highest batting average on the team when this accident occurred. I was able to find out pretty little about him other than just some basic information, where he was born, who he married, the fact that he served in the Army during the war, but he had no surviving relatives and no one I could track down for the story. So in some cases it was easier than others, and that's part of the reason I honed in on focusing in on certain players in the book over others, just because there's more information available.
And the source material. So like, what are you researching? What are you digging into? Or, where are you finding this information? Because it does, to your point earlier, seem to be lost to time a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, thankfully, newspapers.com is a amazing resource for researchers. So really, I started out just going through the daily Spokane newspapers in 1946 when this story occurred. There were two daily papers, and they covered the team extensively. They had each paper had a beat writer who wrote about the team's daily activities from spring training that year all the way through the bus accident. So, my how I approach the book is I tell the sort of the individual backstories of a lot of the players, just to introduce them to the reader, and then get into the actual 1946 season because it was a very competitive team, and they had goals of winning the pennant that year in the Western International League. So I delve into the season, get into a little bit of the day-to-day baseball activities, and leading up to the bus accident.
All right. Well, also set up the time and the dimension, right? So obviously this incident happened in 1946, but part of the narrative, part of the setup of this story is kind of the game of baseball itself, both in this region as well as in this country, right? We're talking about after the World War II had ended, and obviously baseball, not unlike any other professional sport, when we've certainly talked about it with pro football in particular too, very much affected by the wars, the lack of talent and the diversion of talent to the front lines and the war effort, and a lot of these guys, who came back wanted to reignite their careers or and get back into the game and stuff. So in some respects, it was kind of, you're talking about a period of time where for a number of years you had a dearth of players playing domestically, and all of a sudden an influx of players who wanted to come back and get back into the game. Maybe you can just give us a bit of a setup sort of to that dynamic, because it seems like the game was almost overflowing with players returning.
Yeah, that's well put. Yeah, the major leagues did continue during World War II. You mentioned the kind of dearth of talent during the league. They were scraping the barrel for any able-bodied player, including a guy like Ben Geraghty, who I talk about quite a bit in the book. He had originally debuted in 1936 with the Dodgers and had just kind of bounced around the minor leagues, and was actually working at an airplane factory in California when Casey Stengel recruited him back to the major leagues in 44 and 45 with the Boston Braves. But although the major leagues continued during World War II, the minor leagues were greatly affected. Before the war, there were 44 minor leagues in operation across the country, and during the war, that number dropped to 9. And a league like the Western International League shut down, ceased operations during the war. There just simply weren't enough players to fill out rosters. And nearly the entire Spokane Indians roster, this team from 1946, had served in the military during the war, with the exception of a couple players who were just simply too young at the time, including Vic Picetti. And that's kind of why I start the book detailing Jack Lohrke's military service during the war, because I wanted to give the reader a sense of what these players had just experienced in the prior 3 years. And in Jack Lohrke's case, he served in the Army during the war for 3 years and fought in the Battle of the Bulge. So that's kind of where I start the book, and give the reader a sense of what these men had just experienced in the few years before getting back to their baseball careers.
Well, I want to get back to him in a minute for obvious, what would become obvious reasons in a few minutes. But give me a sense though of how this how the season was starting. Right, I got to think in 1946, this is truly, from a sports fan's perspective, from a vanquishing of evil perspective, the United States pride and all that kind of stuff, right? truly baseball, the America's pastime really had a whole deeper meaning, and had to be just a celebration, if you will, of spring and a new turning of page and all that kind of stuff. And I got to think that these guys were treated like local heroes, not only on this team, but also around, I guess, whoever was around the country as well, right? In terms of just the sheer admiration of what these guys had sacrificed, and seeing them back on the diamonds.
No doubt. Yeah, these were certainly, 1946 compared to the previous few years was a time of celebration of, hoping to get back to normal. Although the economic situation in the country was not great in 1946. There was rising inflation and low wages and a lack of housing, even major league teams. I think I mentioned this in the book. The Chicago White Sox offered season tickets to anyone who could help their players find housing. It was that much of a struggle. But for the most part, it was, a time for celebration. And for thousands of these minor league players, it was about resuming their careers and aspirations of making a living playing the game and hopefully making the major leagues. But what they found was there were spring training camps that year were overcrowded with, you had all these players returning from the war, as well as the up and coming players who had, were a little bit younger and maybe hadn't served in the military. And like in the case of the Oakland Oaks, which managed by Casey Stengel, they had about 60 guys in camp, and simply just didn't have room for them all. And that's how so much of their talented players ended up in Spokane that summer.
Give me a sense of some of these names and from where they came, maybe in their military service and stuff. Were any of them in similar units or divisions at all, or were they just? I'm just curious if there were any sort of pre-existing friendships / relationships beside the fact that they were all, a lot of them were former servicemen.
Yeah, a few of them were from San Francisco and knew each other before the war. Vic Picetti and Bob Patterson went to the same high school. They were a few years apart. And also Chris Harchie, who was a few years older than them, was also from San Francisco. And Chris and Bob Patterson both served in the Coast Guard during the war. So it was no doubt that they knew each other. But by and large, they served in a wide variety of units, from the Navy to the Army to the Coast Guard. There was one player that did agricultural work. He had grown up on a ranch in Arizona, Bob James. So he did agricultural work during the war. So these were guys that mostly came from the West Coast, but from a variety of backgrounds.
And how about the prospects for each of them? I mean, I don't have to go specifically one by one, but I mean, in terms of, these were like legit prospects, right? I mean, there's obviously, were there any that as the season was sort of beginning that it stood out perhaps as being effectively ready for the show at some point? Or was it still is at this Class B level at the time still a little too hard to determine whether somebody's got the goods to get to that next level or two?
Well, Vic Picetti was certainly considered a big league prospect. And actually at age 16, of course, this was during the war when there were a dearth of talent. He was actually offered contracts by all 16 major league teams in 1944. And it was reported that he was going to sign with the Detroit Tigers in the fall of 46 after the season. But he was probably considered the best prospect on the team. But there were a number of other prospects who were certainly destined for the Pacific Coast League, which is just a notch below the major leagues. And I think that Bob Patterson had a great chance of making the majors. He was only 22, 23 years old at the time. He was 6'4", had speed and power. Joe Devine, the Yankee scout who signed Joe DiMaggio, was very complimentary of Patterson during the spring of 46 and had him on his radar. There was a pitcher named Milt Cadena, who was the best pitcher on the Indians, who threw a couple of one-hitters early on in the 46 season, and he certainly was destined for the Pacific Coast League as well. So yeah, certainly, always hard to gauge, how far these men would have gotten as far as their major league careers go. But I have no doubts that at least a couple of them would have succeeded in the major leagues.
All right, what's this? Royal Retros. All right, longtime fans of this show may remember a little site that we used to promote the heck out of called 503 Sports. Well, not only are they still around, they are now known as Royal Retros. RoyalRetros.com, the king of throwbacks. And like the name implies, the highest quality jerseys and hats and apparel and all kinds of stuff related to various teams and leagues and situations that we love to obsess about here on this show. And I'm talking about getting jerseys with your name and number on the back of them, customized to your liking for the WHA or old NHL hockey teams that may not exist anymore. Perhaps it's a Federal League team from way back or a Negro League team. Maybe you're just enamored with the various football leagues of the past, like the Arena League or the All-American Football Conference or the original UFL, United Football League. Yes, you can get all of those teams in all kinds of colors, away jerseys, home jerseys. You want to put your name on them. You want to make sure you got the official patch on the side. All of those things and more at RoyalRetros.com. And I'm not kidding, friends. You go there, you want to find that Cleveland Barons jersey to wear and show. Hey, you're maybe a Colorado Avalanche fan and you want to represent the Quebec Nordiques from where they came in the arena to show your heritage and your love and knowledge of the history of that franchise. You can do that and more. And I'm talking across football and basketball and baseball and hockey and you name it. All kinds of great stuff for you to find and buy and purchase and wear proudly from Royal Retros. That's RoyalRetros.com. And of course, we have a promo code for you. We want to save you money from all these great things. And here's that code. It's SEATS, SEATS, promo code SEATS for all of your purchases at RoyalRetros.com. Check them out. You'll be glad you did. We love them. And our friend Destin Alameda there out in Portland, Oregon, we appreciate his and their sponsorship of this show. And now, back to our conversation. Give me a sense of how this season started out, because this tragedy happened, I believe it was sometime in June of this season. What were the, yes. How was the season going? And, can you kind of set a little bit of the tone before sort of this tragedy happened?
Sure. The team had a 3-week spring training in California, and that took up most of April, and they started the season in late April. And we're very competitive early on. They had a little bit of a losing streak. They actually got swept by the Salem Senators, who were probably considered the best team in the league in a 7-game series early in the season. Other than that, though, they played quite well, particularly offensively. They had a number of players hitting well over 300, including Jack Lohrke, who had the 3rd highest batting average on the team, but an infielder named Freddie Martinez and shortstop George Risk had averages higher than Lohrke. Bob Patterson and Bob James were also over 300. So they were hitting very well. They had a lack of offense, however, at the catching position, though, and they sought to upgrade that. They cycled through a few different guys before eventually landing Chris Harchie, former Dodgers catcher who had bounced around the Yankees system as well. They landed him on June 20th, so just a few days before the accident occurred. The team was about 6 games over 500 after a come-from-behind victory against the Salem Senators on June 23rd. And, we're kind of riding high and in good spirits and ready to make a run at the pennant on June 24th when this accident occurred.
So not only what happened, but maybe a bit of background as to how these teams made their way across the various cities in this league, because not unlike the East Coast and maybe even the Midwest, right? These cities are not necessarily close to each other, and they do require significant mileage, usually in a team bus kind of scenario, right?
Exactly. Yes, they traveled by bus. One letter I came across from Vic Picetti, he described the bus ride from Spokane to Salem, Oregon, and it took 16 hours. And this was mostly on two-lane roads that were, some of it was paved, some of it was a gravel road. In the case of traveling across Washington State, now we have Interstate 90, which it takes about 4 hours to get from Spokane to Seattle. But back then it was a US Route 10, which was a two-lane road, and the journey was at least twice as long back then. So travel was not luxurious by any means, and they traveled on.
Plus mountainous, right? I mean, I'm sure the terrain
Oh, yes.
is not flat like in Ohio, right?
Yes, exactly. That's a great point. And yeah, and they were traveling in these pre-war buses that had, in some cases, fallen into disrepair during the war, as many things did in the country. So, yeah, it was in the Pacific Coast League, they did travel by train up and down the coast, but in this particular league, it was all bus travel, and it was pretty rigorous.
How reliable was that travel? Was this sort of this crash indicative of the situation, or was it more of an outlier? I'm sure the wear and tear on players' bodies and stuff. I mean, I guess you get acclimated to it, but by modern day comparison, it's just got to be a real. I mean, I'm sure that, and the schedules probably didn't help either in terms of like I probably have to be at the next city of the next day or so. What of the stature, if you will, of travel? It sounds to me like it was an adventurous endeavor, regardless of how maybe safe or the equipment might have been.
Yeah, no doubt. They when the team traveled to and from spring training in California, it was a 2-day trip by bus, and usually, they would travel on Mondays and then play like a 6 or 7 game series. So Monday was kind of the travel day, and then they would stay in the same city the rest of the week. In the particular case of the Spokane Indians, the bus driver on the day of the crash did complain that there was engine and brake trouble. I don't know how prevalent that was, whether other teams experienced, similar, were traveling on a similar style buses at the time, but this accident was certainly an outlier. There was nothing else like this, that occurred that year or really in the year since, except for one accident in Minnesota, which was a little bit of a different situation.
All right, so let's get into the particulars of what happened. We're talking about, I believe it was June 24th of 1946. Where was the team headed? What was the situation? And what happened? And it seems to me like it was just an absolutely devastating situation. The only thing I can think of that might be comparable would be the Manchester United plane crash back in, the Busby Boys back in the late 1950s, early 1960s. But you describe a little bit of obviously the book goes into great detail, but kind of give our audience a general sense, and you don't have to give away the entirety of the story. I want them to buy the book, of course, too. But what transpired? What happened?
Sure. Well, the team was scheduled to play in Bremerton, Washington, which is on the Kitsap Peninsula, just across the Puget Sound from Seattle. And they departed Spokane on the late morning of June 24th. Basically, that day was a travel day. They were scheduled to begin the series the following day. And the team had made it about halfway to Seattle and stopped in Ellensburg, Washington for dinner. And that's when the bus driver, Glenn Berg, took the bus to the local garage and complained of some brake and engine trouble. And they tried to tune up the bus. He later said that it didn't seem to do really any good. The team ate dinner and then carried on. About an hour later, they reached Snoqualmie Pass in the Cascade Mountains, which is about 55 miles east of Seattle. And just over the pass, the bus encountered a vehicle that had crossed over the center line, according to multiple eyewitness accounts, which kind of forced the bus onto the shoulder of the road. The bus driver attempted to regain control, but ultimately lost control, and the bus broke through a cable guard wire, and the bus tumbled down a rocky ravine about 300 feet, caught fire on the way down, and then came to rest about 300 feet below the road. 6 players died basically instantly, and then 3 other players later died of their injuries. So 9 of the 15 players that were on board the bus died, and 6 others suffered injuries but survived. And the bus driver also survived the crash.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing that not only was such a significant loss of life, but also the fact that there were that many also survivors. How did it sort of get discovered, and like how did the fans of the team sort of discover all of this? Obviously, news was a little more differently spread back in the day. There's even a little story here about Ben Geraghty, who sounds like he was kind of almost instrumental in helping get found and getting people to call for help and the like.
Yeah, back then it was mostly radio, which how people found out about the news, and also newspapers the next day in some cases. There were witnesses, bystanders on the scene who immediately sprung into action, attempting rescue efforts, but it was very difficult because it was nearing dark, and it was also raining that night, and just the terrain made getting to the scene very difficult. And rescue efforts continued throughout the night into dawn. And then, yeah, slowly news began to come out about the accident. At first, it was just, basically, the owner of the team back in Spokane received a telegram over the Associated Press wire that the team was involved in a bus accident, but they didn't know, who was involved or how many players were killed. And then slowly the details would come over the wire. So there was a story of several newspaper writers and the front office personnel of the team all kind of huddled around the wire, just waiting for news to come. So that was kind of how the initial news was spread, and of course it was documented in newspapers across the country the following day.
And tell me about Ben Geraghty. He was a coach on the team. He wasn't the manager at the time, but he had the reason I'm bringing him up, right, because he was noted, I think, for helping get this crash scene discovered and all that, and he was pretty banged up. It seems like he was, I don't know if you label him a hero, but he was certainly instrumental in the aftermath and ensuring more people survived than not.
Yeah, Ben was actually the second baseman on the team. He had just joined the team a few weeks before. He was 33 years old and kind of at the tail end of his playing career.
Oh, I'm sorry. He played as well as managed, or am I commingling that? I got the sense that his playing career was, or maybe that was his major league career playing.
Yeah, he later managed the team. It was possible that he had been signed as a player with the intent of him becoming manager, but he was Mel Cole was actually the player manager of the team, and Ben was just the second baseman, but later did manage the Spokane Indians. Was hired to manage the team subsequently. So Cole,
that's where I'm mixing stuff up. But okay, but arguably a leadership role in the midst of a tragedy, right? So arguably. Yes. Showing some stripes in that regard, albeit in such a situation.
Yeah, and you mentioned he was quite banged up. He broke his kneecap and sustained a head injury. But yeah, kind of took on a leadership role after the accident, and was hired to manage the team because they resumed play just a week later, but was found that he was physically unable to assume those duties at that time, but then became the manager of the team the following year. But yeah, Ben certainly kind of took on that leadership role. He was 33 at the time, and kind of a veteran presence on the team. But the player manager, Mel Cole, was killed in the accident.
What was the immediate aftermath? I mean, you mentioned there were a number of players who survived the actual crash, but later succumbed to their injuries. Was there hope that there would be more survivors from all this? And frankly, what was the impact in not only the league, but I'm guessing this was a national baseball story too, because this is a tragedy of proportions that I don't think had ever really been, and even since, been experienced in baseball.
No doubt. Yeah, this made headlines in the New York Times and the Sporting News and newspapers from coast to coast. It was front page news. Sort of immediately, as all of the players who were not killed at the time of the accident were taken to Harborview Medical Center in Seattle, and they had varying extent of injuries. A couple of the players who later died of their injuries had severe burns. Others had relatively minor injuries, just a couple of broken bones or some minor burns. So it did vary a little bit as far as the extent of the injuries. But ultimately, of the 6 players who survived the crash, 5 of them were able to resume their playing careers in some capacity.
How about the fans and the league and the other players and all that kind of stuff? It just had to shake. It must have shaken them to their core.
No doubt, yeah, and that came across in several quotes I saw from other league personnel and players in the league. This was truly devastating. To have this much loss of life in such a horrific manner. And these were, young men on their way up who had just survived the war. They were, in many cases, young fathers. They were brothers and husbands. So it was truly devastating, and the impact, extended well beyond baseball. But yeah, sort of a few days afterwards, I think there were talk about when would the team resume playing. And they ultimately decided to start up playing just a week later. But of course, they had to come up with basically almost a whole new roster of players. Interestingly, it was initially reported that other teams in the league would kind of loan the team players to help fill out the roster. But that actually didn't come to fruition, except for 1 or 2 players from the Salem Senators. And the Sam Collins, the Spokane Indians owner, was quite frustrated by this sort of lack of assistance by the rest of the league. And ultimately, he became affiliated with the Brooklyn Dodgers through Branch Rickey later that summer in order to help fill out the roster.
So you're saying that what was their affiliate relationship at that time before that became that of the Dodgers? Did you mention that before and I missed it, or was there a PCL relationship between this team?
Yeah, so they were independently owned, but they had these sort of informal working agreements. So they would get players, like in the case of the Oakland Oaks, sent them 5 or 6 players, as did the Padres from the PCL, and as did the Yankees. But it wasn't really until after the accident, they had this more formal affiliation with the Brooklyn Dodgers, whereas basically every player on the team, subsequently, with the exception of 1 or 2 players, was under contract with the Brooklyn Dodgers.
Interesting. Tell me about, so we mentioned him before, but I think now is appropriate time because you're mentioning the Padres and they play a role in this. Tell me about Jack Lohrke and his nickname and perhaps why he got this nickname. And it's not just because of this incident, is it?
Not at all. Yeah, Jack had this incredible life story and numerous brushes with death. As I mentioned earlier, he fought in the Battle of the Bulge, and upon returning to the States after the war, was bumped from an airplane that subsequently crashed. He was about to board the first flight of his life from New Jersey back home to California when he was bumped off the plane by a higher ranking officer, and that plane later crashed near Kansas City. So just from the war and this sort of near plane crash, Jack had already had some close calls with mortality. And then on the day of the accident, Jack was on board the bus when it left Spokane, but while the team ate dinner in Ellensburg, a police officer tracked him down and passed along a message from the team that the San Diego Padres wanted him to report to San Diego. He was being called up to the Pacific Coast League. Jack was performing very well. And so he said goodbye to his teammates and hitchhiked back to Spokane while the rest of the team carried on. It was just an hour later that this accident occurred. And so pretty quickly, Jack was labeled with this nickname, Lucky, which he was never really comfortable with the nickname, and you can understand why, just given the reminders, of his friends, both in the military and on the Spokane Indians that weren't lucky. But Jack performed very well with the Padres after being recalled, and then was drafted in the Rule 5 draft by the New York Giants that winter, and had a seven-year big league career with both the Giants and Philadelphia Phillies.
Yeah, and you hint not only him, but also there were other players that continued to, they truly went on, and obviously a deep mark in their backgrounds, but there was life still to be led and careers to be fulfilled, and I'm guessing that's a bit of some solace here, that it wasn't just a terminal event completely, that there were some sort of ongoing stuff. It's got to be interesting too. I in my research for this, I did see there was a quote in Sports Illustrated from 93, 94 or something with Lohrke, and he kind of acknowledges that, there's not much I can do about this name, but it's and sure, I consider myself fortunate, but my name's Jack, for God's sakes, and I'm trying to live my life going forward, and it's hard. Right, it's very hard when people want to remember and they don't know otherwise how, and a nickname which is arguably, not necessarily in any untoward way, just I'm sure there's a very difficult psychological framing that one has to kind of deal with going forward in life on a both positive and negative basis. And it's just got to be an interesting life story after this event for him, not just on the baseball field, but just in life going forward.
For sure. And in Jack's case, he was very reluctant to ever talk about this incident or his military experience, even with close family or friends. And fortunately, I was able to speak with a couple of Jack's children who shared some details, just describing how much he disliked, talking about it. Even for this Sports Illustrated article, which you referenced, it took numerous calls from Sports Illustrated before he finally agreed to submit to that interview. And even then, his quotes are pretty brief. So yeah, it was, in his case, his way of sort of coping with this was just, trying to put it out of his mind and not talking about it. Whereas there were other players who were, a little more open to discussing it later in their years. But yeah, each player kind of handled it in different ways. So that was kind of an interesting thing to observe in researching this story.
It sounds a little Greatest Generation Tom Brokaw-ish, right? Because that's kind of how guys dealt with that kind of stuff, or frankly didn't deal with that kind of stuff. It was not, I don't know, it's just tragic events. I mean, the idea of therapy and the idea of how to psychological, assistance. That, I mean, a lot of the guys shut that stuff off, right? And their families had to really do a lot of digging, sometimes, frankly, posthumously, to kind of know what was really, happening with these guys. They either wanted to just forget about it or bury it or just move forward and not sort of, deal with it sort of fully, maybe to their detriment. Maybe that's just psychologically how they were wired, but that does not sound too dissimilar from a lot of people of the era and relate people who have been related to especially war returnees of that era. It almost seems like that's not uncommon. I don't know if you agree or if that even
Yeah, no, I
scratches to what
completely
you're.
agree. Yes, I would definitely agree with that. And also in the case of a guy like Ben Geraghty, he coped with this by turning to alcohol. And fortunately, I was able to interview some players who played for Ben, and each of them, noted, how alcohol affected his life. And yeah, there was nowadays we have the diagnosis post-traumatic stress disorder, and I'm sure that if someone were to really dig in and analyze these players, that diagnosis would certainly have been apt for this group.
Right. So give me a sense then, of, I want to say the legacy, but sort of the impact of this, right? Clearly there's multiple layers of impact here. Obviously the players that survive, the families of those who did survive and those who didn't. Baseball as a sport and sports generally, in terms of teams and tragedy and that kind of stuff. And frankly, I think too, just how this event gets remembered, commemorated, not forgotten, or maybe it has been, and it's taken you and your investigatory skills to kind of make it more memorable.
Yeah, and you mentioned that there being multiple layers to this, and that's a good way to put it, because you can kind of go case by case with each player. And in some cases, particularly with the players who died in this crash, they were so young, and many of them did not have children, or were just engaged to be married. And so when they died, there was a pretty abrupt loss. And in the case of Bob Patterson, for example, I was able to interview Bob's niece, who was very young at the time when he died, and has no memory of him, but has kind of carried this throughout her whole life, that there's just sort of this loss, that that there was this uncle that she never got to know. And then, of course, in other cases, you had players who did survive the crash, who had long lives, and so just very very sort of different stories within the story, as far as the legacy of the players and how they're remembered. But by and large, what I found in researching this story is that I think diehard baseball fans of a certain age are vaguely familiar with the story, but certainly the names of the players who died have largely been forgotten. And I think most baseball fans are probably not aware that this crash occurred, not aware that it's, to this day, the deadliest accident in the history of American professional sports. So yeah, I hope this book kind of commemorates and honors those players who had sacrificed years of their lives during World War II, and each of them had interesting, fascinating lives, which I describe in the book.
Are a couple of odds and ends, and I'll let you promote. I guess top among them is what, if anything, is commemorated by the current Indians franchise and/or minor league or major league baseball, if anything? Is there any remembrances? Is there any memorials, either in physical form or in commemorations of the date of the tragedy, that kind of stuff? Is there anything visible at Avista Stadium there, which has been there since the mid 1950s? Or is it truly lost and forgotten until your book?
Yeah, well, I went to a game last summer, and in the program that the team handed out to fans as they entered the ballpark, there was a nice story describing the events. 3 or 4 page story. I think most people in Spokane, over the years, there's coverage of this, particularly on anniversaries. Every 5 years or 10 years, the local paper does some pretty extensive coverage of the event. But if you go to a game today, and I was just at a game a few weeks ago, you walk into the stadium and there's really no indication that this event occurred. One of the players, Levi McCormick, is inducted into the team's Rim of Honor, so his name is sits above the bleachers. But by and large, you would have no idea that this occurred if you just walked into the stadium today. And similarly, at the crash site near Snoqualmie Pass, there's no indication that that this accident had occurred there. So I think in many ways it has been forgotten. There are some commemorations here and there which keep the story alive, particularly in Spokane. But outside of that, it's certainly not widely known.
Has anybody come out of the woodwork since this book came out, or is it still too early maybe to tell that maybe those ignorances, if you will, could be rectified, and maybe something actually could be more physically, focused on memories, both the stadium or maybe the site, that kind of stuff?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in my research, I attempted to track down, anyone who could have memories or was related to people who were involved in this story. I did a signing the week the book came out a couple weeks ago in Spokane, and a couple of family members of the players who I had reached out to but hadn't been able to get a hold of. They came to the signing, and so I was able to meet them. I also met a 91-year-old gentleman who actually worked at Ferris Field that summer, and so had firsthand remembrances of these players. So that was miraculous. I wish I would have been able to talk to him before the book came out. But I just did an event in San Francisco this last weekend and met up with a couple other family members that I had interviewed. So just kind of getting to know these people who also feel that their relatives' stories have been forgotten, and are pleased with how the book came out. Has been really rewarding to me, and it's probably been my favorite part of this experience.
Well, as we're recording this, the book has only been out for about 2 weeks or so, maybe 3, and it would be shocking to me that some folks with knowledge and power and capabilities would not sit up and take notice and perhaps try to make an effort to do something more lasting and permanent, I guess. Because I mean, like I said, you're mentioning not only this is not a tragedy that just happened in minor league baseball back in the day. This was something that transcends all of professional sports, right? And this is, sadly, one of, if not the most tragic events in professional sports history in the United States. And the fact that it is so, lost, I guess, until a work like yours, it's kind of sad, frankly. And I would imagine that there are a lot of people who would like to kind of make amends on that and learn from all of it and commemorate that of what happened. And they're just remembering that's part of the tableau of the history of this franchise and what's happened before, which is what what history is all about, is not forgetting what happened beforehand.
No doubt. Yeah, I would personally love to see that, maybe a more permanent marker or something at the ballpark now, as well as the crash site. And that's something I'm exploring through my connections in SABR, is maybe putting some kind of landmark at the crash site to remember the victims of this incident. But yeah, I would certainly like to see this go beyond the book, and these players be honored, both at the ballpark and the crash site.
All right. Well, God forbid we can get a few extra people who wouldn't have known about this book otherwise to perhaps entertain that idea after having purchased and read this book. All right, before I let you promote, I do have to ask you about this one interesting thread, which I need maybe a little bit of definition about, if you can. In my research, I did notice that there was a book, sort of a recount of this story, but not really, called Until the End of the Ninth, that was published back in, I don't know when it was, by this woman, Beth Mary Bollinger. I'm assuming you know of it. And can you maybe describe a little bit about, it's not quite a recount of this story, but it certainly borrows heavily from it and then extends it in an interesting direction.
Yeah, it's an interesting book. And Beth's approach with this was that it was a work of fiction based on the team. And it was written about 20 years ago. And I, of course, early on in this process, I wanted to see, what other literature was out there about this. And I read some online, what I could find about this book online, and realized that it was, a work of fiction based on the team. And so I was very hesitant to read it myself. So I did not, in reading her book, it's difficult to tell, what is fact and what is fiction. So I actually did not read the book until after I was finished with mine. I did not want to cloud my research at all with her book. But it's a different approach. It kind of has a bit of a Field of Dreams-esque type approach to the story, whereas she describes the players who have passed looking down on the team from above, and there's dialogue between the players who have died. So a little bit of a different, certainly a different approach than mine. But it is good that there's this other creative work out there that explores the team.
All right, our thanks to Eric. The book, a must-get and a really terrific read. It is called Season of Shattered Dreams, Postwar Baseball, the Spokane Indians, and a Tragic Bus Crash That Changed Everything. It is published by our friends at Rowman and Littlefield, and you can get it wherever fine books are sold, your local independent bookseller down the street. Or if you'd like, go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Search up this episode number 348 with Eric Vickrey, and you'll find a convenient link, of course, to the book via Amazon, and we'll get a couple of referral shekels of love. Thank you for doing that. But by whatever means, run, don't walk to get a copy of this book. And again, Eric Vickrey is the author and our guest, and he can be found online at ericvickrey.com. I'll spell it for you. ERIC. Vickrey is VICKREY. ericvickrey.com. You can also follow him on the Twitter X thing at Eric_Vickrey. You can also, if you happen to be in various parts of the Pacific Northwest, he'll be out there signing some books. So tell him that you heard about the book and him on this show, and perhaps he'll give you a special extra little notation in your signature. But depending on when you're listening to this, May 30th, he'll be doing a presentation of book signing at Paulina Springs Books in Sisters, Oregon. May 31st, he'll be doing a book signing at the Portland Pickles home opener in Portland, Oregon. June 9th, a presentation of book signing at Village Books in Bellingham, Washington. And on June 26th of this year, presentation of book signing at Kingfisher Bookstore in Coupeville. I hope I say that right. Coupeville, Washington. So get out and meet Eric. Tell him you heard about him and us. And send us a picture. It doesn't happen unless you send us a picture. All right. Let's see. Goodseatsstillavailable.com. It's where all of our stuff is. Hey, by the way, go to our website again, goodseatsstillavailable.com, and check out the merch section. A couple of convenient links to our friends at oldschoolshirts.com and royalretros.com, and our own merchandise at tpublic.com. You'll see a convenient link there. You can find merch featuring our unique Good Seats Still Available logo, but also through that link, a ton of merch. That could be, what the hell I'm trying to say here, clothing and mugs and magnets and stickers and all that kind of stuff, featuring tons of team logos and insignias that have come and gone, shall we say. You will enjoy the offerings there. Please, by all means, check that out too. We're on social media at Twitter X. You'll find us at Good Seats Still. You will find us on Instagram at Good Seats Still Available. You'll find us on Threads at Good Seats Still Available. You'll find us on Facebook at Good Seats Still Available. You will find us on YouTube at Good Seats Still Available. Get the hint? Our website, I already said, but our email, that's what I'm trying to say, is hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. Our thanks again to Jerry Payne, as always, each and every week. Jerry Payne, Audio Excellence. Thank you, sir. And we'll see you all next week. Thank you for listening. Bye.